Let's give Ben a drum roll and welcome Ben to the Blah 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 stage. Here we go.
So yeah, talking about science fiction in the end of the world, don't let that put you off. Even if you're not into science fiction, I know a lot of people aren't, you can still enjoy the bits about the impending global apocalypse. So I think science fiction is at its best when it offers interesting hypothetical scenarios. So I'm going to start with one of my own. Imagine that you've just got back from work and you're tired and you sit down and you turn on the news just to relax, and it's all about Boris and COVID and climate change and wars and mass shootings and floods and fires. Just stop, turn it off. Let's watch a TV show maybe, or a film to relax. How about The Handmaid's Tale? About a fascist government that grooms sex slaves because pollution has made everyone infertile. Or The Hunger Games, in which an ecological disaster has created a fascist elite who enjoy watching teenagers fight to the death with medieval weaponry. Or The Giver, in which societal collapse leads to a fascist government that kills babies outright. Or Elysium, in which the planet is so polluted the fascist elite have to go and live on a space station instead. Or The Rover, set after an economic collapse where people wander around the lawless wasteland shooting each other. Or The Walking Dead, where people wander around the lawless wasteland shooting anyone who's not already been eaten by a zombie. Or there's always The Purge, where an economic collapse creates a fascist government which actually makes it legal to wander around shooting people. Or maybe you prefer The Man in the High Castle, where it's not a fascist government in charge, but an actual Nazi government. Nice little twist. You get the point. Sci-fi is pretty bleak these days, long before the pandemic. It's been going like this for a few years. And I wanted to know why. I wanted to find out what's behind this. There's always been dystopian settings in science fiction, but recently it's been hard to find anything that isn't utterly bleak. So I decided to do a little science experiment. I realised, in the words of Matt Damon in The Martian, I'm going to have to science the shit out of this. Real dialogue from the film, by the way. I soon ran into a problem in that I know nothing about science, which may have something to do with watching too much sci-fi. But let's not dwell on that. I realised I was going to have to rely on memories of science lessons from school, which was quite a long time ago. But as I remember, you always have to start with a list of apparatus, don't you? So this is what I used to make this talk. Wikipedia, obviously, that's where you get facts from. Spreadsheet, that was tedious. IMDb, YouTube. I thought about trying to buy all the films I wanted to talk about, but I'd have to start getting stuff on Amazon, which didn't feel right given the whole dystopia thing. Neck, fingers, eyes have just been thorough here. Also, you can't just have 3 things on the list, you've got to flesh it out. I imagine this is how they do it at CERN. They just sit down every morning, write a list. Several hundred white lab coats, 1 large Hadron Collider, 40,000 biros, that sort of thing. What's next? Method. Here comes the science bit, as they used to say in hair and beauty adverts. My method was to compile a list of forward-looking science fiction films, 10 examples from the last 7 decades, and it's a mix of books and TV shows and movies, but I wanted to go for the big important stuff that people remembered. So this is just the list that I've compiled. This is the 50s, was the Golden Age of Sci-Fi. They say, you'll know some of these from the films that came later, but I've gone with the original date that the books or the story was originally written. In the 50s, most of the stuff wasn't really set too far. Some of it's set in the future, some of it's set in the present day, and it's usually about aliens landing on Earth or cities being destroyed by radioactive creatures and or very tall women. So a lot of this doesn't concern us. 60s and 70s, it starts getting interesting here. There's lots of kind of a mix of art, like weird art films and kids shows. There's a few dystopian settings. But there's some positive stuff like Star Trek and the Jetsons coming in there. But you notice in the 70s it starts dipping into this kind of dark and nihilistic stuff with Soylent Green and Alien. 1980s, it kind of carries on in that vein, except, well, you've got The Handmaid's Tale. You also got this Battlefield Earth. I don't know if you know that. It was written by the founder of Scientology, Ron Hubbard, right? It's the only sci-fi book I know that comes with a special soundtrack composed by the author. He made a 13-track electro-jazz album to accompany the book, and I've listened to it, it's awful. I don't recommend that. Anyway, the 2000s, unfortunately a lot of these, some good ideas in these sort of movies, but it's often accompanied by Tom Cruise, which renders them null and void, in my mind. Not because he's a Scientologist, just because he's Tom Cruise, but, well, findings, right. So I went through this list and worked out in each case, what was the biggest threat to humanity in those movies. And I made a graph, killer robots, first off. They've always been a quintessential part of sci-fi, but as you can see, it was only in the 80s that they started to be considered like a real threat, like notably with things like the Terminator and Robocop. Before that, they were kind of clunky household servants who did chores and made funny noises, right? Here's Robbie the robot. Here's an unstoppable killing machine. Then we've got aliens, once feared as destroyers of worlds and enslavers of minds, but it seems we're not that bothered by those guys anymore. And what's next? Nuclear war, look. It had its moment, but it's not what it used to be, nuclear war, is it? Not quite what it used to be. Corporate dystopia sort of waxed and waned, which is odd, given that they basically rule the world. By the way, viruses didn't really feature in this sample set, unless it's to sort of turn people into sort of monsters or zombies. But the biggest one is fascist regimes. Like, I've sort of taken a loose interpretation of what the fascist regime is, but you know it when you see it, when there's kind of hundreds of extras marching around in matching uniforms. It does look good on the screen, can't deny it, but that can't be the only reason. I wonder whether all this sort of bleakness is a problem with storytelling. Some people would say it's sort of an innate problem with storytelling, as in like optimistic futures are boring, or that you can't have drama in a perfect world, but I'm not really convinced by that. I don't see why you can't situate drama in a world that's better than ours, and you definitely don't need a dystopian setting to tell a good story. So why does sci-fi seem to be on a constant downer? I wondered, have we given up on the future, or is there something in our psyche that means we're titillated by doom? Incidentally, I realised that would make a great name for a goth band. We are titillated by doom. Anyway, back to the science. When I was doing this experiment, I started noticing strange patterns in the data I collected. I realised that if you took the inception date, which was when a science fiction story was made, along with the year that the story was set, the story context, you could determine the futuristic interval by applying the following formula: SC minus I equals Fi. I knew I was onto something here. So The Matrix was made in 1999 and was set in 2199. 2199. So The Matrix has a futuristic interval of 200 years, right? By this point in my discovery, there was all these kind of green numbers cascading in front of my eyes, which made it quite hard to see what I was doing. But that's how I knew I'd make an important breakthrough. SC minus I equals Fi. The more mathematically minded among you might just think this is simple subtraction. Technically is that, but all scientists have got to start somewhere. I started by immediately making another graph. I know you love graphs. This one shows all the things on each one of those nodes is one of the stories on my list, and it shows you their corresponding futuristic interval. So the peaks are when a story is set really far in the future. So look at the Planet of the Apes there, it's literally off the scale. I could have made the scale bigger, but I didn't, so it's off the scale. You'll notice there's this dip in the 80s again. All these films are really set like 50 years from now, because they wanted to make it seem more dramatic or something. it's hard not to equate that with the kind of politics of the time. It picks up again in the 90s, but you can see the overall trend is obvious. So it seems that the extent to which we can imagine the future has shortened dramatically over the last 70 years. And we no longer sort of tell stories of far-flung, fantastical epochs. We're kind of concerned with what's around the corner. And just as sci-fi's got darker and more apocalyptic, it's also kind of got closer to home, closer to now. I wondered, in other words, it seems like our collective cultural imagination is finding it harder and harder to envisage a future for our species. Now, I did intend this talk to be light-hearted, but it gets worse. Because if you extend that trend, based on the rate of decline since the 60s, I've calculated that science fiction in the next decade will have an average futuristic interval of 3.6, which means that sci-fi films released at the start of 2025 will be set in the summer of 2028. It's all maths, I'm just giving you the maths. Presumably, as it declines further, some movies will be set directly after you finish watching them, which will be fantastic. And it seems probable that the average futuristic interval will hit 0 at some point in the subsequent decade. So science fiction's ability to foresee the future will end shortly after the year 2030, I've discovered, which is almost exactly in line with the tipping point for climate change as predicted by most scientists. But we probably won't need science fiction anymore when we're living through a global extinction event. Although living is probably the wrong word. Moving quickly on. This is a book I read about. It argues that scientific warnings about climate change don't really work. They're often ignored because they only appeal to the intellect rather than the emotions. And the emotions that they do evoke are usually guilt and gloom. And the author says that the kind of pessimistic alarmism that I've just hit you all over the heads with is kind of counterproductive. He says, instead, there's a crucial role to be played by storytelling, and the myths he talks about in his title, they're not errors to be debunked, but they're kind of the ideas and beliefs that motivate and shape a culture. And he says we've got a myth at the heart of we've got a kind of a gap at the heart of our cultural myth that needs to be filled. And stories are how you fill that gap. That's what he's talking about. The book identifies 3 areas where stories can help us generate optimism and inspire collective action. A larger us, which is like an expanded view of ourselves as a species with a common fate. A longer now, as in being able to think of ourselves as connected to the future, and a better good life, which I think just means that we need a decent remake of the 70s sitcom. But we'd only go and ruin it with fucking Tom Cruise. Now, I did read this book, I might have got that bit wrong. Let's push on. You couldn't invent a problem that's harder to solve in climate change. So, it's an abstract concept, it's difficult to explain, it's unpleasant to think about, and it requires a unified global response. The disaster movies like, what was this, The Day After Tomorrow, quite effective at alarming people, but they can just as easily be dismissed as being over the top, right? Or going too far, and they don't really offer much hope. Because any solution to climate change kind of rubs against the structures of our psychology and our power structures, and business and politics works in such short cycles that it's really hard to address long-term problems, even if there wasn't like a collective will to do that. So what we need is a bigger perspective, or a longer now. I think that's what I got from that book, was the idea of a longer now. But hold that thought, because I'm about to go off on a random tangent. I do this, it's just one of the things I do. A couple of years ago, I went on tour with my band, and we happened to be in Paris. Bear with me, it does get somewhere. When the Notre Dame was burning, I don't know if you remember that, it's sort of, seeing this ancient building in flames affected me in a strange way. Like, I felt a sense of loss that I couldn't really account for. When we drove past, naturally I took a very bad photo. My bandmates obviously weren't affected in quite the same way. Anyway, the Notre Dame, it was built in 1163, and it was started built in 1163 and wasn't finished until 1345, which gives it a futuristic interval of 182 years, right? 13 French kings came and went during that time. Builders devoted their whole lives to the cathedral, as did their sons and grandsons and grandsons' grandsons. I watched it burning in 2019, which, as it happens, was exactly 182 years after Queen Victoria came to power in Britain. So imagine if Queen Victoria had commissioned the building that had been finished 182 years later in 2019 when this happened. I was wondering, it made me think, how would that have affected our culture's sort of perception of time, that we were still connected to Queen Victoria in that way? And 182 years isn't even that long. The Milan Cathedral took 579 years to build. In fact, it took so long to build that the phrase building the cathedral has become local slang for taking a really long time to do anything. So like, what are you doing in there? Just building a cathedral. But even that's not very long. Stonehenge, this was built over 1,600 years. Almost mysteriously, it sort of seems to have been started and then left for a very long time before being finished. Typical British builders, eh? Turn up in the morning, make a mess, bugger off and don't come back for another millennium. What's next? Great Wall of China, even longer. Built over the course of 2,200 years. In terms of thinking ahead, this beats Planet of the Apes by a couple of hundred years. By the way, it's not true that you can see the Great Wall of China from space. That myth was first put around in 1754, which, unless you believe in some very strange conspiracy theories, was a long time before we got to the moon. But this is what you can see from up there. When astronauts first viewed the Earth from space, it had a profound effect on the way they thought about life back home, basically. And a similar shift occurred in the minds of many. When images of our planet came back from the Apollo 17 mission, this photograph is known as blue marble. It was taken in 1972, and it seems to have prompted people to think in terms of a larger us, like it became a symbol of the environmental movement. Unfortunately, whoever took this photo was an idiot, because that is Africa in the middle. It's upside down. What do they do? Luckily, someone clever at NASA turned it the right way up and made the colours a bit better. That's obviously the photo that you're familiar with. So if this viewpoint, if this kind of idea of looking back at ourselves shifted the way we thought about our planet, maybe a view of ourselves from the lens of a faraway future can alter how we see our actions today. And I think if we're going to solve a climate change or a pandemic or any of the problems we face, we need to be thinking long term. And science fiction isn't doing that now. So maybe science can help. Here's a real scientist. He's called Danny Hillis. In 1986, he announced his plan to the world to build a huge mechanical clock in the desert that will run for 10,000 years. His intention was to make people think beyond the barrier of an ever-shortening future. And he said his clock would tick once a year, bong once a century, and a cookie would come out every millennium. So he sounds like a nut, right? But I want to tell you just a little bit about his life. When he was at college, he managed to build a working computer out of an old wooden toy set. Pretty impressive. Took me longer than that. He went on to design supercomputers that were like 1,000 times faster than anything else around. And when he was at a meeting with the US military, instead of giving out a business card, he gave out little jars containing DNA encoded with his contact information. So I think it's brilliant. That was in the 90s, right? He also held conferences in the treehouse and drove the fire engine to work. So he might be a nutter, but he's an amazing nutter. His project is called the Clock of the Long Now. It was actually named by Brian Eno. The plan stalled for years until an investor stepped in and gave him $42 million. So this clock is either an act of kind of hubristic folly or a profound and optimistic signal for our species. Maybe it's both. And it's actually going ahead. They started building the clock in a hollowed-out mountain in Texas. Ironically, no one knows when it's likely to be finished. But from what I gather, work on the clock is going like clockwork. Thank you. Now, it seems like more thought has gone into this clock, it occurred to me, than a lot of sci-fi. Movies tend to go for like a worst-case scenario without really having anything to say about it. What was once a form of progressive social commentary now feels like sort of lazy nihilism. It's the end of the world. However, there's a certain group of people who have never really seen sci-fi as a kind of critique of technology. But, for some people, it's not about accepting a dystopia in the future or even trying to stop bad things happening. For some billionaires in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, it feels like sci-fi has been like a blueprint for the future. What have these guys got in common? Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos. They're all pretty good with computers. They all like to be photographed against a pale blue background. They're all incredibly rich, unscrupulous businessmen. This is me recorded, is it? Just for the record. The answer is they're all massive sci-fi fans, basically. And it's the same for a lot of tech pioneers in Silicon Valley. In 2018, this is a car in space. Elon Musk launched a car into space with a dummy at the wheel. David Bowie's Space Odyssey playing on the radio. It's a real photo. It was a stunt. It's a kind of publicity stunt, but it was an inspiring one. This car is just carrying on this trajectory out of our galaxy. His company, SpaceX, is leading the new space race, and he once said that they could be ready to put people on Mars by 2026. He also famously said that he wants to die on Mars, just not on impact. And along with Richard Branson, he's thinking big and thinking long term, and it's proving to be infectious. And that investor that stumped up $42 million for the clock, that was Jeff Bezos. So maybe it's not that sci-fi's lost its capacity to inspire us. Maybe it's that the people it's inspiring at the moment are mega rich, and the things they're excited about aren't necessarily utopias. So has the genre failed in providing us with dreams of possible futures? Or has it actually succeeded by encouraging geeky tech guys to attempt these audacious projects, you know? Does it matter? Do we have to worry that the future is being defined by billionaires, or is it okay that we've got a future at all, even if it does look like a corporate dystopia? Predictions. I couldn't remember whether these were going to come at the start or the end of an experiment, so I put them here. Obviously, Blade Runner got it wrong. That was set in 2019, and I still don't have a replicant slave. According to Pacific Rim, 2020 was meant to be the year of the giant fighting robot. A little wide of the mark. According to Johnny Mnemonic, in this year, at some point this year, a cyberpunk courier that looks a bit like Keanu Reeves encountered a sentient, cybernetically enhanced dolphin that helped him to decrypt his own mind. Have you seen that one? Pretty good. Obviously next year we'll all be eating little green wafers that definitely are made from plankton. So that's what we've got to look forward to. This is ridiculous. Many writers are less interested in predicting what's going to happen, warning us against futures. That's what The Handmaid's Tale is about. That's what Ray Bradbury was trying to do. But these apocalyptic narratives have become so familiar that they're like comforting now. Last year there was a huge surge in demand on Netflix and other services for disaster movies. People fucking love watching disaster movies in the middle of disaster. Especially the 2011 movie Contagion. Hands up who's seen this movie? Yeah, a couple of people. Did you watch it last year?
Yes.
Yeah. It's quite accurate. But the worrying thing about this is Matt Hancock said he watched this and it partly inspired his vaccination strategy. It's kind of worrying. Just to be clear, I don't think COVID pandemic is an apocalyptic event. A lot of people have spent these dark, desperate months in their pajamas watching Netflix. It's not the same. It's not the same as leather armour with chains and spikes, is it? COVID, if anything, it's a fluffy dress rehearsal, right? We get one chance to prepare. So that's my uplifting, positive message, by the way, just in case that one slipped you by. I can't imagine many studios or publishers are going to be wanting to put out more stories about the end of the world after this. I think instead we'll see a spate of kind of memoirs and books set in 2020. Lockdown lit will become a thing. That's my prediction. But the bigger question is where our cultural imagination goes next, I think. The global nature of the pandemic has forced us to think in terms of a larger us, and it's possibly made us reassess what a better good life means on a personal and societal level. It's also shown that sudden radical changes are possible, but we won't simply bounce back into a better world. We need to know where we want to go, and we need stories to guide us. That's the end. Thank you.